I let my son's friends crash my stepdaughter's birthday after she got out of the hospital, let them mock her as a prank, and backed my wife when she demanded everyone laugh. Now the school has labeled my kids bullies and I don't understand why. I'm posting here because I feel like I've completely lost the plot on what's considered normal parenting anymore. And everyone around me seems convinced I've crossed some invisible line that I genuinely don't understand. I'm 45, remarried for 3 years, and part of a blended family that has been a work in progress since day one. My wife Melissa is 41. I have a son, Jake, who is 14 from my previous marriage. My stepdaughter Hannah is 13 and lives with us full-time. Jake lives with me full-time as well, with visits to his mom, Tara, on some weekends. From the outside, it probably looks like a typical blended household with the usual growing pains, but I've always tried to be the adult in the room who keeps things fair and calm. I'm very aware of how easy it is in blended families to accidentally favor one child over another, so I've made a conscious effort not to do that. If anything, I've tried to be neutral to a fault. I don't jump to defend Jake just because he's my biological kid, and I don't treat Hannah like glass just because she's Melissa's. I've always believed kids benefit from being treated like equals, even when that means being uncomfortable sometimes. A few weeks ago, Hannah was hospitalized unexpectedly. It was scary, but not catastrophic. She had an appendectomy after severe abdominal pain, spent a few days in the hospital, and was discharged without complications. The doctors were clear that she'd recover quickly. She was sore and tired, but she wasn't fragile, and she definitely wasn't on bed rest by the time she came home. Her birthday was already scheduled for the weekend after she was discharged. Melissa was adamant that we not cancel or overly dramatize it. She kept saying Hannah didn't need to feel like her whole life had to pause because of a medical scare, and I agreed. I didn't want Hannah to feel pitied or treated like she was weak. The plan was a small, low-key celebration at home. Cake, pizza, maybe a movie. Nothing big. Here's where the issue seems to start, according to everyone else. Jake asked if he could invite a couple of his friends over during the party, not to make it about him, but because he said Hannah always complains the house feels quiet and awkward when it's just family. I didn't see the harm in it. I figured a little noise and energy might actually make things feel more normal, which was supposedly the goal. Melissa hesitated but eventually agreed, saying it might help everyone feel included as a family instead of separating Jake time and Hannah time. Hannah didn't object when we mentioned it. She didn't look thrilled, but she didn't say no either. At 13, I don't expect kids to always articulate exactly what they want, and I also don't think silence automatically means trauma. Sometimes it just means they're indifferent. The day of the party, Jake's friends showed up, and I'll admit they were louder than expected. 4 teenage boys in one living room is always going to be chaos. They were joking, roughhousing a bit, talking over each other. Typical stuff. Hannah was quieter, sitting on the couch, scrolling on her phone, but that's pretty much her baseline anyway. At some point, the boys started joking about Hannah's hospital stay. One of them pretended to push an IV pole made out of a broom. Another did an exaggerated weak voice impression, saying things like, "I'm too fragile, I just got out of the hospital." It wasn't nice, but it also didn't strike me as malicious. It was stupid teenage humor, the kind of thing that's awkward and immature, but not intended to actually hurt someone. They kept calling it a prank, saying they were just trying to lighten the mood and make her laugh. Hannah clearly wasn't laughing. She looked embarrassed and uncomfortable, and she got quiet in that way where you can tell someone is upset but trying not to make a scene. This is where people say I should have stepped in, and maybe that's true in hindsight, but in the moment I hesitated. Melissa laughed awkwardly at first, and then she started encouraging Hannah to laugh too. She said things like, "They're just joking," and "Come on, don't be so sensitive," and "This is how boys bond, they tease everyone." I backed her up. I said Hannah needed to loosen up and not take everything so personally. I genuinely believed that intervening would make it worse. I didn't want to single Hannah out or make her feel like everyone had to tiptoe around her. I've always believed resilience matters. Life doesn't stop being uncomfortable just because you've had a rough week. I told her calmly that embarrassment doesn't kill you, and learning to take a joke is part of growing up. The party continued. The boys moved on to something else. Hannah stayed quiet but didn't leave the room right away. I took that as a sign that things had de-escalated. Apparently, that was wrong. Later, Hannah went to her room and cried. Jake and his friends joked about how she couldn't take a prank and how everyone laughed except her. I told them to knock it off, but I didn't scold them the way people now seem to think I should have. I told Hannah privately that storming off and sulking wasn't helping, and that she'd basically killed the mood of her own party. I didn't yell. I didn't punish her. I just told her she needed to work on not letting small things ruin the day. A few days later, I get a call from the school, asking me to come in for a meeting. Apparently, Hannah had spoken to a teacher or counselor about what happened. I was told there was an investigation into bullying. Not just teasing, not just a misunderstanding. Bullying. Jake and his friends were named. Hannah was offered support services. I honestly thought there had been some kind of mistake. At the meeting, the counselor used words like public humiliation, medical vulnerability, and forced participation. I was told the prank crossed a line because it targeted Hannah's hospitalization, and because adults in the room reinforced it instead of stopping it. I was told Jake would face disciplinary consequences, and the other boys' parents would be contacted. I pushed back. I said no one intended harm. I said kids joke. I said this wasn't a sustained campaign of harassment. It was one awkward moment that got blown out of proportion. The counselor kept emphasizing that intent doesn't erase impact, which sounds nice in theory, but feels completely detached from reality when you're dealing with teenagers. Now Jake is facing consequences at school. Hannah barely speaks to us at home. Melissa is furious that the school labeled our household as unsafe. Tara, my ex, is suddenly involved and acting like I've permanently damaged our son. I feel like I'm living in a parallel universe where normal family conflict is being reframed as abuse and bullying, and I don't know how we got here. So I'm asking honestly, when did kids joking around become bullying? Am I really wrong for backing my wife and refusing to overreact in the moment? Or is everyone else just determined to see the worst possible interpretation of what was, in my mind, a stupid but survivable situation? Update 1. After the initial meeting with the school counselor, I assumed we'd be dealing with a warning, maybe a short-term consequence for Jake, and then everyone would move on. I was wrong. Within a week, the school formally classified the incident as bullying. Not a misunderstanding, not kids being kids. Bullying, in writing. Jake was suspended for several days and removed from his extracurricular activities temporarily. The other boys involved faced similar consequences, and their parents were notified with full descriptions of what happened, including the fact that the incident targeted Hannah's recent hospitalization. That detail keeps getting emphasized, as if that alone changes everything. I pushed back again, this time harder. I asked how a single incident at a private birthday party became a school matter. The administration explained that because Hannah reported ongoing emotional distress afterward, and because the boys attend the same school, it fell under their anti-bullying policies. They also said that the involvement of adults at the party, meaning me and Melissa, made it worse, not better. That part stung. I don't see myself as some negligent bystander. I was there. I made a judgment call. Apparently it was the wrong one. Jake was furious when he found out about the suspension. He kept saying Hannah could have just said something, and that she went nuclear for no reason. I told him to cool it, but I didn't shut that line of thinking down the way I probably should have. At the time, I still believed this had been blown out of proportion, and I didn't want to invalidate his feelings completely. Then Tara got involved. My ex-wife called me the day after the suspension was finalized, and she was livid, not just angry, controlled, icy, and furious in a way that told me she'd already made up her mind. She accused me of enabling cruelty and failing to protect a child in my care. She said this wasn't about Hannah being sensitive, it was about Jake learning that humiliating someone was acceptable as long as he could laugh it off. She threatened to revisit custody. She didn't outright say she'd take Jake away from me, but she didn't need to. The implication was clear. She said she wasn't comfortable with Jake being in an environment where emotional harm was dismissed as humor. That was the first moment I felt something shift from irritation into something closer to fear. At home, things got worse instead of better. Hannah withdrew almost completely. She stopped eating meals with us, stopped watching TV in shared spaces, stopped responding when either Melissa or I tried to talk to her beyond basic necessities. She stayed in her room with the door closed or left the house whenever possible. Melissa's response to this was not helpful. She doubled down. She kept saying Hannah was playing the victim and that the school had clearly decided to side with her because of the hospital angle. She insisted the boys were being punished for joking and that Hannah was manipulating the situation by crying to authority figures instead of dealing with things at home. I backed her at first, at least outwardly. I didn't want to undermine my wife, especially when I still believed our intentions had been misread. But internally, I started to feel something I didn't like: uncertainty. The school requested a follow-up meeting, this time with a counselor present to discuss restorative steps. That meeting was uncomfortable. The counselor spent a long time explaining the difference between intent and impact. I've heard that phrase before, but this was the first time it was directed squarely at me. She said that regardless of whether the boys intended to hurt Hannah, the impact was that she felt publicly humiliated, targeted over a medical vulnerability, and pressured to participate in her own embarrassment. She used the phrase, forced participation, which caught me off guard. She said Hannah wasn't just teased, she was expected to laugh along, and when she didn't, the adults reinforced the idea that her discomfort was the problem. I wanted to argue. I did argue. I said kids need to learn resilience. I said shielding them from discomfort doesn't prepare them for real life. I said we can't treat every awkward interaction like trauma. The counselor didn't argue back. She just asked me a question that's been bothering me ever since. Did Hannah laugh? I said no. She asked if anyone asked her how she felt in the moment. I couldn't honestly say yes. She asked if the adults in the room validated her discomfort or dismissed it. That's where things started to get harder to justify. After that meeting, I started replaying the party in my head, over and over. I remembered how Hannah's face changed when the jokes started, how she didn't speak up, but also didn't smile, how I told myself silence meant it wasn't that bad. I realized that at no point did she actually consent to being the butt of the joke. She was just stuck. I also started noticing things I'd previously brushed off, how often Hannah had removed herself from family activities, how frequently I'd sided with Jake during conflicts because I assumed sibling rivalry was mutual, how easy it was to tell myself I was being neutral, when, in reality, my neutrality always benefited the louder, more comfortable person. The house became tense. Jake grew resentful toward Hannah, openly blaming her for his suspension and loss of activities. He said things like, "She ruined everything," and, "If she wasn't so sensitive, none of this would have happened." I told him to stop saying that, but I didn't sit him down and dismantle the logic behind it. I didn't challenge the idea that Hannah was responsible for the consequences of his actions. And that realization hit me harder than I expected. Melissa and I started arguing. She accused me of wavering. I accused her of refusing to see any perspective but her own. She said Hannah was driving a wedge between us on purpose. I said that maybe Hannah felt unsafe. That did not go over well. The counselor recommended individual therapy for Jake and offered Hannah additional support resources. There was also a suggestion, not an order, but a suggestion, that Hannah might benefit from spending time away from the household until things stabilized. That suggestion felt like a gut punch. I didn't think I was the villain in this story. I still don't think I acted with malice, but I can't ignore the fact that everything I did in the name of keeping the peace ended up protecting the people who were already comfortable and exposed the one person who wasn't. I thought I was being fair. I thought I was preventing drama. I thought not choosing sides was the mature thing to do. Now I'm starting to understand that not choosing a side is still a choice. I'm not saying I suddenly agree with everything the school has done. I still think the term bullying carries a weight that doesn't fully reflect what happened. But I can't deny that Hannah was hurt, that I minimized it, and that my silence and my agreement gave permission for it to continue. I don't know how to fix this yet. I don't know if it can be fixed. All I know is that I thought I was keeping the peace, and I'm starting to see I was choosing comfort over protecting her. Final update. I've sat on this update for a while because I didn't want to write it out of anger or defensiveness. I also didn't want to rush to some dramatic self-flagellation that wouldn't be honest. This isn't that. This is where things landed, whether I like it or not. Not long after my last update, the school counselor formally recommended that Hannah spend some time away from the house. They were careful with their language. No one said danger or abuse outright. But the implication was clear. Hannah didn't feel safe, not physically, but emotionally. And according to them, that mattered just as much. Melissa reacted badly. She said the school was turning Hannah against us, that this was an overcorrection fueled by guilt and optics. She accused the counselor of projecting adult concepts onto teenage behavior. She asked me if I was really going to let a bunch of administrators dictate how our family functioned. For the first time, I didn't immediately agree with her. I didn't argue either. Not at first, but something in me had shifted. The more I replayed the party, the more I replayed the aftermath, the more I realized I'd been operating under a false assumption that peace was something you preserved by smoothing things over, not by confronting discomfort. That assumption had failed Hannah completely. The counselor helped arrange for Hannah to stay with her aunt for a while, Melissa's sister, framed as a cooling-off period. Hannah agreed immediately. That alone told me more than any meeting or report ever could. The night she packed, she barely said a word. No yelling, no accusations, just quiet efficiency. Watching her fold clothes into a bag she'd clearly been mentally packing for days was unsettling. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, it was final in a way that scared me. I told myself it was temporary, that things would stabilize, that once the school dust settled, we'd regroup. But that wasn't how it went. Jake's situation worsened before it improved. He was required to attend counseling sessions as part of the school's intervention plan. At first, he treated it like a joke. He said the counselor was on Hannah's side and that he was being punished for literally nothing. Then, slowly, the tone changed. He came home one afternoon quieter than usual. He didn't say much during dinner. Later that night, he asked me, not defensively, not angrily, if I really thought what they did was funny. I asked him why he was asking. He said one of the counselors asked him to describe the prank without using the word joke. He couldn't. That conversation didn't magically fix anything. Jake didn't suddenly become empathetic or remorseful overnight. But it cracked something open. He started to acknowledge, reluctantly, haltingly, that maybe it wasn't Hannah's job to laugh just because everyone else expected her to. That was when it hit me hardest. He learned that expectation from us. From me. Melissa and I began arguing more openly after that. She accused me of siding against her. I accused her of refusing to acknowledge harm. She said Hannah was fragile and manipulative. I said fragility doesn't excuse cruelty. That was the first time I used that word out loud. Our marriage hasn't recovered. I don't know if it will. Melissa refuses to accept responsibility for what happened. She insists Hannah misinterpreted the situation and that apologizing would validate a false narrative. I've stopped trying to convince her otherwise. At some point, you either see the damage or you don't. Hannah eventually agreed to speak with me, once, with the counselor present. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She didn't accuse. That almost made it worse. She said she didn't feel safe in our house because when she was uncomfortable, she was told to be quiet. When she was hurt, she was told she was sensitive. When she tried to leave the situation, she was blamed for ruining it. She said the worst part wasn't the prank. It was that the adults, the people who were supposed to protect her, laughed or told her to laugh. She asked me why I never stepped in. I didn't have a good answer. I tried to explain that I thought I was de-escalating, that I didn't want to embarrass anyone further, that I believed things would pass. Even as I said it, I knew how hollow it sounded. She told me she didn't hate me. She said that calmly, like a statement of fact. She said she just didn't trust me, and she didn't know if that trust could come back. She asked for limited contact going forward, not no contact, but distance, space, control. I agreed. That was one of the hardest things I've ever done, not because I felt wronged, but because I knew I had no right to argue. The school's ruling stands. I've stopped fighting it. I've stopped insisting on intent. I've stopped saying no one meant harm, as if meaning it makes the harm disappear. I see now that my version of neutrality was never neutral. It aligned with whoever was loudest, most comfortable, least affected. Silence wasn't peacekeeping. It was endorsement. I wanted harmony so badly that I ignored the cost. This isn't a redemption story. Hannah hasn't forgiven us. She may never. Our household isn't fixed. Jake is still learning. Melissa and I are still at odds. There's no neat resolution waiting around the corner. But I understand something now that I didn't before. Not choosing sides is still choosing a side. And when you choose comfort over protection, the most vulnerable person always pays the price. I can't undo what happened. I can only stop pretending it wasn't what it was.